Hey Games Workshop, I'm gonna fix your crappy Warhammer boards. Nothing elevates tabletop wargaming like engaging, immersive and thematic terrain. The spectacle, the cinematics, the tactics, the storage. And in this video, I'm taking you on the journey of making awesome textured versions of these fold-out Warhammer boards. While doing this, I'll also make it double-sided and easy to store. So buckle up! This will be me pushing myself to breaking point and beyond to create two incredible looking Warhammer boards that don't need a huge amount of storage space. Storing custom game boards is no simple task. In fact, it's one of the things that people comment about most on my videos. They say things like, I'd love to make a game board like that, but I've got no place to store it. So what do? First, we have to build a frame. After a trip to the local hardware store, I had the materials I need. The base is a 9mm thick sheet of MDF cut to an appropriate size for skirmish games. I measured lengths of 30 by 30mm pine timber and marked 45-degree angled lines for cutting. So the lines with the circles is where I was supposed to be cutting. Okay, so my unfortunate little cutting mishap means that this piece of timber is useless. And that means that I'm now a piece short. Which further means that I need to go back to the hardware store and buy more overpriced New Zealand timber. For fuck. Now that I had the correct number of pieces cut to size, I applied some wood glue and carefully clamped them into place to line up as perfectly as possible. Cutting the timber at 45-degree angles allows the timber to line up perfectly at each corner and creates a strong joint. Once all four sides of the frame were fixed in place, I worked on the opposite side. For extra strength, I drilled the timber frames together, being careful to line each side up as perfectly as possible. For a nice smooth finish, I applied polyfiller over all the joins and screws. Once that was dry, I sanded the whole frame smooth and slightly rounded the edges and corners for a nicer finish. Okay, so that's the frame construction complete, and now it's time for the fun part, to build the boards themselves. I measured and cut a piece of 10mm thick sheet of polystyrene to fit within the frame. I spread PVA glue evenly across one side of the MDF and then pressed the polystyrene sheet into place. I was careful to press firmly across the entire sheet to remove any air bubbles and ensure the polystyrene would be consistently level. So I've borrowed the Skaven type board off my friend, and it has these included objective markers. I'm not really a fan of objectives done in this way. They look a little silly and out of place to me. So I'm setting myself the challenge of incorporating these objectives into my board in a more subtle and believable way. I'll also draw inspiration from some of the details, like the bricks, cracks, and various bones scattered around. But I also aim to tone down the level of fantasy so that it's a bit more versatile across different game systems. So with that rough plan in mind, I mapped out where the circle objectives would be, along with the random cracks and crevices scattered across the board. I then hacked into the polystyrene with a blade. Cutting into the board in this way will give what will otherwise be a very flat board some much needed depth and 3D space. It will also allow me to add details sunken into the board in a way in which they will not interfere with any scattered terrain that gets placed. Now it's time to cut some foam bricks. An absolutely insane amount of bricks. Or are they tiles? Nah, I'll stick with bricks. Bricks sounds, I don't know, more tough and manly. Okay, not sure what happened there. Anyway, so here I am cutting 5mm thick sheets of XPS foam. Lots of them. I need to cut enough bricks to cover this entire board, so I laid out the sheets to check visually. Now that I had enough sheets of foam processed, it was time to cut millions of strips. Not actually millions, that's an exaggeration for effect, but a lot, a stupendous amount of strips. I cut a bunch of 2cm wide strips and then even more 1cm wide strips. Brutal. So I've cut a ton of strips and now I need to cut them down into tiny little individual tiles. Bricks! I'm starting to seriously question my decisions in life at this point. No time for self-doubt. I have a bountiful bunch of bricks to process. To try and work efficiently, I gathered up multiple strips and pushed them through the hot wire cutter to create stacks of bricks with each pass. The downside of doing it this way meant that those little bricks melted to one another slightly and would need to be separated. The hope was that the old bag of rocks texturing technique would break them apart anyway. Success! However, carefully picking out those little bricks got old real quick.
Well, this sucks.
Necessity is the mother of invention and led me to raiding my wife's stockings. I gripped the stocking firmly over the end of the vacuum hose and marvelled at my own brilliance. This was a perfect solution with no chance of mishaps. So after a couple of mishaps along the way, I settled into the rather tedious and repetitive routine of cutting, texturing, and vacuuming bricks. For interconnectivity, the bricks were cut to specific dimensions of 1x1, 1x2, 1x3, and 2x2 centimeter sizes. Over the last 3 days, I have cut and textured an absolutely insane amount of bricks. There's well over 1,000 in here. I've got 4 different sizes that I've arranged in my different ice cream containers, and then I've got these 3 circular ones for the objective markers. That just leaves 2 more circular objective tiles, bricks, over here that I need to cut and texture, and then I can finally start gluing them onto my board. That's gonna have to wait for tomorrow though, because it's almost midnight and I've got work tomorrow. So I'm gonna get my beauty sleep and hit it again tomorrow. So after a grueling day of teaching, I was back at it. I would love to spend more of my working day making content like this, so if you find any value in it, please consider supporting the channel through my Patreon, which is linked in the description, or by making one-off donations through YouTube Super Chat or Buy Me a Coffee. It turns out that working full-time, supporting a family, and producing YouTube videos is quite a lot of work. Thank you so much to those who already support the channel. You truly are hobby heroes of legend. If you're interested in how I cut these circular bricks, I cover it in detail in my magic floating platform video linked in the description.
And finally, the time has come to start gluing these bricks onto my board.
Okay, so I glued the circular objective bricks first so that they could be placed accurately based on the spearhead board I referenced at the beginning of the video. The rest of the brick pattern would need to work around those objectives. I used PVA glue to fix the bricks in place, working on a section at a time. I would love to say that this was a therapeutic and zen activity, but it just wasn't. It took me about 7 hours to glue all those bricks in place. And that's including help from my wife Wendy. She's a dissectologist, so she loves this kind of thing, and actually needed very little convincing to lend a hand. Unfortunately, despite the help, loving spouse banter, and the promise of what I assumed would be a very cool end result, I felt like my soul was being slowly crushed one tiny foam brick at a time. It was at this moment that I started thinking of potential video titles. The Warhammer board that broke me. All in all, it's just another brick in the Warhammer board. 7 signs your hobby has become pathological. Or my personal favourite, I used to enjoy this hobby. But in the end, the shadow is only a small and passing thing. There was light and high beauty once the final brick was laid. Which hasn't actually happened yet. The little gaps by the circles needed filling with specially cut bricks, and then still more irregular and broken bricks were added to the crevices. Okay, now that's the last one. To accentuate the look of wear and tear, I carefully carved small cracks into the bricks with my X-Acto blade. Adding this level of detail really adds to the character and believability. Okay, with the thousands of foam bricks finally glued in place, it's time to start the next phase of texturing this board, and that is to fill in the cracks with rubble and some extra details. So to do this, I have some broken bits of my foam bricks. I've got this mix of lake sand and just gravel from the side of the road, and finally some little 3D printed skeletons and bones. After applying a prodigious portion of PVA, I pressed into place the broken bricks, a sprinkle of rubble, a pinch of fine sand, and a scattering of skeletal remains. I absolutely love adding characterful little details like this. I salt base sprinkled a little rubble and fine sand all over the board to fill the more egregious mortar joints, which is the actual term for gaps between bricks. Or grout joints if you want to call them tiles, which I don't. Using a brush ensures all those gritty grains go where you want and don't obscure those beautiful bricks. For some extra variation, I sprinkled some tile grout. You got me. Brick grout. Let's call it brick grout. Now it's time to seal. Baby! I tried a number of different methods here. First I tried spraying everything, but the matte sealant just didn't seem to be getting in between the bricks as much as I would like. Then I used a pipette to add isopropyl alcohol before adding the sealant. That was fine for the areas of rubble, but would be way too excessive for the whole board. In the end, I settled with a spray of ISO before a liberal brush of sealant. This definitely used more sealant than using a spray bottle, but at least I could rest assured those bricks that were created at such personal cost would have a good level of solidity and protection. I'm loving how this board is looking so far, and now it's time to start painting. Disaster! I had planned on spraying the whole thing to start painting, and I thought that I had some of this foam-proof spray paint ready to go, but it turns out I don't. This is supposedly a matte sealer, so I had a little bit of an experiment, and I sprayed some foam with this first, and then tried spraying it with some regular spray paint, and it's just melted. I'm melting! It's a good thing that I tested on some spare pieces before committing to this board, because that would have been an absolute horror story. So it does mean now that I'm going to have to paint the whole thing by hand. I started by priming the entire board with a highly watered down mix of black house paint and Modpodge. By making the paint so thin, it should seep in between all those individual bricks, and by adding Modpodge it adds another level of protection in the long term. The problem with thinning the paint so much is that it will take forever to dry, especially in New Zealand winter. I'll also need to make plenty of touch-ups with my airbrush. I decided to take advantage of the long drying time by wet blending in some different coloured acrylic paints to give the bricks tonal variation. Airbrush time! This actually made the previous step a bit redundant, to be honest, but you know, I just really love using my airbrush, so worth it. So yeah, the whole point of this was to again add some tonal depth to the bricks. This gives the finished look so much more realism than simply going with shades of grey. The colours I went with were various browns, greens, and even some magenta to give an interesting contrast. If you want the full list of colours and materials used, you'll find them in the video description. And then to really bring out the stone texture of the bricks, I applied a dry brush of light grey all over. Again, variation is key. I don't apply the same level of dry brushing everywhere. I press firmly with the brush in some areas and more gently in others, so that coverage is not too uniform. I used a smaller brush to get at some of the finer details in those crevices. Then I went back with the airbrush and brought back some of the colour again, particularly the greens in and around those cracks, and I applied some watered down sepia ink here and there to add to the grimy look. It was then time for some brushwork to bring out those characterful little details. In this case, the bones were painted with bleached bone. I then used Seraphim Sepia and Athanion Camoshade washes to add some shading and blend them into the board. For a lovely professional finish, I painted the frame with semi-gloss black paint. I probably should have done this before painting the bricks, but anyway, a steady hand was needed on the inside to avoid messing up the look of those bricks. After all the effort to make those bricks look awesome, I really didn't want to ruin them with a random hand twitch. I mean seriously, if anything happens to these bricks, I think I might just, well, I don't know what I'd do. I mean, I'd be upset, that's for sure. It's funny that I actually thought this side would be the warm-up for the next part, which I figured would be more challenging technically. But goodness me, what a journey this has been. Anyway, I need to clear my work table for the next phase of this project, and I'm in desperate need of a coffee break, so I'll catch you up in a bit.
1 hour later.
Oh, what the hell? Oh, no.
Disaster! So you could clearly see claw marks, like some beast of chaos has gotten stuck into this thing. So the evidence is pretty clear. My cat has used this board as a scratching post. Harper! Oh, that's so annoying.
You've got to be kidding me. What a catastrophe. Simply appalling. I need a pause for thought. Ah well, it's meow or never to spin this as the perfect weathering technique. Okay, I promise that's enough cat puns. For real. So after picking away the loose bits of foam, I filled the cracks with black paint, airbrushed some of the same colours as before, and dry brushed with grey. Now it just looks like some chaos demon has been on the loose, which is actually pretty close to the truth. To be fair, he could probably smell those Skavens sneaking around below those bricks. Okay, we're halfway there, because remember, I still need to make the other side and work out how to store it. Join our Hobby Hero family by subscribing if you want to see more terrain building tips and tricks like this, and hit the bell so you don't miss future updates.
So what do we add to the other side? Well, like many of you, I'm hella excited about the new edition of Kill Team coming out.
Damn bugs.
Although, that price is absolutely mad.
No, no, no.
And I'm not sure about some of their questionable design decisions.
Hell no.
Anyway, I'd love to pick up a copy.
But I'm skint, so I'm going to be theming this side of the board to an older Kill Team. My beloved Orc Commandos. In the Kill Team Octarius set, there were these Orc Badlands themed boards. I love the semi-buried remains of scrap scattered around. Here's what looks like an Orc bike, some bits of wagons and trucks, even the front of a Morkanaut. Well, here's where my pile of shame really pays off. I just so happen to have a lot of the kits that these details come from.
I also have a whole lot of Orc bits I can rummage through for scrap. I clipped out various components from the Orc vehicle, battle wagon and Morkanaut kits that I thought would look cool in my scrap heaps. The Kill Team Octarius terrain has some great looking stuff to incorporate into the board. I hacked into some of the scrap barricades to get yet more bits. These kits aren't cheap, so to save money I'm going to use blue stuff to clone some scrap with Milliput.
That's the kettle. Cheers.
Blue stuff is amazing. I've reused the same material dozens of times by simply heating it up and casting each texture. Wearing gloves will help to avoid burning your hands, but it turned out I only had one, so I guess I'm going for that Michael Jackson look. The heat makes the blue stuff soft and malleable. You simply press the object you want to replicate firmly into it and push in the sides. Wait for the blue stuff to cool, using a fridge can speed this up, and then pop out the plastic to reveal the mold. To cast these pieces, I used Milliput. This is a 2-part epoxy putty that becomes rock hard after a few hours, so is perfect for casting these bits of scrap. If you want to have a go at making something like this, and you need to buy some blue stuff and Milliput, or any other hobby materials, then please consider using my affiliate links listed in the description. This is a great way of supporting the channel as well as your own hobby. As you can see, this doesn't perfectly cast bits, but it really doesn't need to for what we're doing here. This is meant to be scrap after all. It just needs to capture the basic shapes and texture to create convincing looking scrap for the board. I also had these textured styrene sheets, square rods and plastic gears. Once I had a big enough pile of scrap, I mapped out where they would be incorporated onto the board. Dividing the board into sections and referencing the Kill Team cardboard mats, I marked with a Sharpie where the craters full of scrap would be. I then used a blade to cut out those craters. The challenge here is to create the scrap piles in a way in which they won't obstruct any scatter terrain that I need to place. So the craters need to be deep enough to do this. The polystyrene sheet wasn't thick enough, so I pieced together the remaining sheets of XPS foam from my brick cutting marathon. With the XPS glued in place, I used a blade to cut cracks leading out from the craters to give the impression of split and fractured stone. I cut some pieces of textured styrene sheets and glued them onto the board and set about filling those craters. To do this, I used a whole lot of hot glue to fix the various components into place. Roughly broken chunks of cork were added to flesh out the rubble, and in this case hold the two Morkanaut parts at the angle I wanted. And then I simply added bits of orc scrap haphazardly to try and create an interesting and authentic look. Using a small flame, I softened and bent a piece of corrugated styrene. This really sells the look of scrap. I carefully brushed PVA glue into the cracks and gaps between scrap before adding gravel, followed by a sprinkling of sand. I continued these steps across the board until all my reserved scrap was used up and all the craters were filled. Next, I need to add the ground cover. So I drizzled PVA glue all over the flat areas around the craters. In hindsight, I added way too much glue here and would have been better off working more methodically and in sections. The same could be said for the addition of tile, grout and sand. Ah well, hindsight is 20/20. So here I go, sprinkling an excessive amount of this mix all over the PVA and essentially obscuring a lot of those crater details I had carved.
I've been really pushing myself this week to try and get this board done, putting in some solid hours after work each night, and I think I've just been getting tired and have started making some silly mistakes. As you can see here, there are these very noticeable gaps between the segments of XPS where the PVA and the grout has settled into, and it's a little bit obvious.
So I used a brush to sweep excess grout in to fill the cracks and gaps. I don't usually like to use brushes on grout because you can end up with very unnatural looking brush patterns. I mean, let's face it, orcs are not known for their fastidiousness. But fear not, I have an idea for dealing with this issue. In any case, brushwork was definitely needed to smooth the transitions from the grout onto those textured styrene sheets and to clear any excess away from important details. It's always a bit of a balancing act to achieve a natural look without obscuring detail. The ground cover, rubble and scrap was all sealed in place by spraying isopropyl alcohol before spraying with matte sealant. The ISO breaks the surface tension and allows the sealant to penetrate the layers of aggregates. I'm often asked how I make my matte sealant, so if you're interested, check out the how-to video linked in the description. While the grout was still damp and marshy, I pushed a few extra little details into place. And then I released my inner child and drove some toy buggies across the grout to create tyre tracks. While doing this, it was very hard not to make brum brum sounds. Now on to painting. I mixed brown and orange paint and thinned it with some water. This reddish brown will be my base colour, so I painted it all over the board, including the scrap piles. I know Games Workshop loves their tan sand, but I like this terracotta colour. I then hit it with my airbrush. This was to touch up some of the areas that I missed with my standard brush, as well as adding some tonal variation across the board. As always, dry brushing really starts to bring everything to life. This has to be one of my favourite steps. I just love how it makes all those shapes and textures really start to pop. For this I used the same orange paint that I had mixed in with the brown earlier. Remember not to load up your brush too much. You can always go back and add more if needed, but it's much harder to fix if you apply too much. I then applied the metallics. For this I used Ledbelcher and used a standard brush to apply scuffs and scratches before dry brushing more generally over all of the scrap piles. The tyres and leathers were then painted with black contrast paint to set them apart from the metals. The skulls were painted with bleached bone and then washed with Seraphim Sepia. I'm absolutely loving the look of this board, and embedding the scrap within the board means I can place scatter terrain wherever I want without issue. I cannot wait to play some games of the new version of Kill Team on this board, and battle over some scrap worthy of a true orc Big Mech.
I am in love with this board. Having the 3D texture and details is such an improvement on those flat Games Workshop Warhammer boards, and really adds to the immersion in gameplay. And having two vastly different themes incorporated into the same board is just so convenient. Let me know what you think in the comments. Like, has one of your beloved pets ever sabotaged your work? And if you enjoyed this video, then please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Now let's take it into the house and see what my wife thinks.
Oh, you're not bringing more wargaming stuff into the house, are you?
What do you mean more? Hey honey, come and check it out.
That's pretty cool.
The painting is from my beautiful sister who is a Sydney-based artist. Check out her Instagram at Little Rowan Redhead. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time here at 3D Games.
Until then, good hobbying everyone.